God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves? The murder of all murders, what was mightiest and holiest the whole world has ever known, is bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off our knives? What water is there to cleanse ourselves? So Nietzsche said this in 1882 in The Gay Signs, and thus spoke Zarathustra. And what he was thinking about when he wrote this was not necessarily that God was dead, nor that necessarily religion was dead, but it was a warning. It was a warning to Western Europe, because at that time, in Enlightenment, there was a fervor of enlightenment, that it put forth science, and that if it couldn't be seen, it couldn't be true. It was a dismissal of religion, and it was a dismissal of faith. You had to prove it to see it. And he believed that if this was to continue on, there'd be nihilism and chaos, and the world would come to an end. So I studied philosophy in college, and I love it, and to this day I still do, and I think it makes me a better doctor. But I want to invite you to think with me today a little bit. I got a lot of ideas from here. Many of you I share these ideas with. But I want to look at fillers and neurotoxins, or neuromodulators. Could it be the beginning of the end? Could we imagine a time period where fillers and neuromodulators don't exist anymore? Or at least the market as we know it today doesn't exist anymore? Saturation points. If I were to ask any one of you, what in life can you not have too much of? Is there anything in life you can't have too much of? Pretty much everything in life reaches a saturation point. There's almost nothing that doesn't. You can certainly eat too much. You can drink too much. But if I ask most of my friends, when I started thinking about this concept a little while back, I said, what can you not have too much of? I got the staple answers. Can't have too much money, can't have too much love, can't have too much sex, can't have too much happiness. Well, I would argue that one of those you can't have too much of. Love. Perhaps love, but other than that, nothing in this world can you not have too much of. Clearly, there's saturation points all through chemical, physical, and material sciences, and I think even in emotions and socially. You can reach a point where there's too much, and even with relationships. But what about aesthetic providers? Is there a saturation point of aesthetic providers? Do we get to a point where we've trained too many people and we're not doing anything better? In fact, we're starting to get a negative consequence because we're training so many people. Many want in, there's no doubt. I was just training a bunch of providers. The UIC Derm residents come to my office from University of Illinois. So I was training a bunch of them. And some of them immediately are great. And you know this as well. For those of you who train, you have people come into your office, and some people, they're holding the needle, and the needle's all over the place. You know they're never, ever going to be able to be good at it. There are other people who've got great artistic skills, but they don't have the affability. They don't understand the aesthetic patient. They don't understand the aesthetics of what someone should be, and they don't understand the retail component. To be really good in aesthetics takes multiple facets. It's not just being one. You have to have many. You have to have many. And it's not easy to be an aesthetics provider. It's much like a NASA astronaut, a Navy SEAL, and an Olympic athlete. These people are the best of the best. There's lots of people that want to be Navy SEALs, but not everyone can be a Navy SEAL or an Olympic athlete. Eventually, you have to say, you know what? They're just not the top. They're not going to be good enough to be at that top of the top. Not everyone can be an aesthetic provider at the highest level. It's probably, in my opinion, the upper third standard deviation. That's 1.2% that I believe are really probably the best at what they do as aesthetic providers. And I would argue that all of us in this room are at that level. But we're not the norm. All of us in the room are not the norm. There's the masses of people out there that are injecting that I'm referring to. And we keep training and training and training. I'm not suggesting don't train. I think training is important. But I want you to think a little bit about how we train and what we train and who we're training and why we're training them. Because when the more people we train, what happens? If I'm training all these UIC residents and all these other people that are coming to my office that want to learn, I'm training them. But not all of them are going to be that upper one-third standard deviation. Some of them are just going to be, they're going to be okay. They're going to be average, which is fine. But what happens is when you train a lot of people and a lot of people inject, you get regression to the mean. This is a natural phenomenon in mathematics and in science. You guys all know regression to the mean. We regress to the mean, but when we regress to the mean with our outcomes, the mean today is an unnatural result. It's not bad doctors getting bad results. It's actually quite a few good doctors. But maybe we're not training exactly the best way. I watch Arthur and Paul. This is fantastic. I watched many of you inject over the weekend. It was great. It was great training for me. But I'm not sure if that message is getting out to the masses of people who are training, not just aesthetic providers, but also the nurses and PAs that are starting to inject now pretty much routinely all across the US and many of the other countries as well. Because this unnatural result is my #1 barrier to getting patients into my office, without a doubt. It's not money. It's not the product. It's the unnatural result. Every single day, a patient comes into my office and I have to say, you're going to look natural. But Dr. Dan, I know I can tell when someone's had it done. No, you can't. If I do it, no one's going to know, I tell them. If they don't believe me, I have to sit there and convince them because they're so convinced that the unnatural result is what's going to happen to them, and it's not. But why are we getting all these unnatural results? Why is it such a barrier for all of us to have to leap over that unnatural result? And I would argue that maybe it's becoming from the training purposes. Maybe it's the way we're training. Maybe it's the way we're training because we promote and we teach unnatural. If any of you have done on-label training, you know what I'm talking about. You go and you teach someone, and they're like, but doctor, where do you put it? Well, I can't really say anything about that. Ask me afterwards. Well, you really put it in the dermis? I put it deep. You know, you come up with these answers to try to say to them where you really do, but you can't because it's off-label in the US at least. So we're teaching the masses unnatural, and they're reading articles on ways that none of us do it in practice. This is the way we do it. Watching Arthur and Paul right now, watching all of you this weekend, that's how we really train, but that's not what we're teaching. And think about how we train, and think about how we learn, and think about how we measure our outcomes. 2D photo scales. 2D photo scales are not natural results. This is not a natural result. We've been using 2D photos since the 1880s or 1890s when plastic surgery first became a field. Look at this patient. Nasolabial folds, 2-point improvement. Watch her animate.
Mary had a little lamb.
And the second line?
Twinkle, twinkle, little star.
And then the third line?
Little Bo Peep has lost her sheep.
Okay, and then can you pucker for me? Okay, smile real big. Okay, and can you state your full name?
Do you see that? Is it very clear to all of you how natural she looks in this area right there? When she animates, you see it. The problem is when she doesn't animate, it's a great result. This is a 2-point improvement or a 1-point improvement. This would be an outcome that's positive. This is what I shoot for in clinical studies. For those of you who do clinical studies, you know we have to shoot for these outcomes. But that's not what I do in practice. When products get approved with 6 cc's of filler, that's not what we do in practice. But this is the outcome that gets published. And this is the outcome we talk about. If I'm putting 52 units of toxin in the forehead, I'm not making people look better. But that is the outcome that we're being taught. Fillers in the mid to deep dermis, nobody puts it there. We know from the Arlette article that it always goes into the subcutis. But the masses are being taught about how to put into the mid dermis, and you get results like that that look unnatural, and then it hurts the whole field. We all suffer when there's unnatural results. Our whole field is injured by that. So evidence-based medicine is the greatest thing that medicine saw in the last 2 decades, according to this BMJ article. And I like evidence-based medicine. So for those of you who are scientists here, you're gonna argue with me a little bit, and I'm okay with that. And some of you I'm going to insult a little bit. But evidence-based medicine's got its flaws also. Do you know that the evidence that evidence-based medicine improves outcomes is lacking? There's no evidence that evidence-based medicine improves outcomes. Evidence-based medicine is great, but it has to be interpreted through a lens of reality and practicality of what we do in clinical practice. If I do evidence-based medicine, I inject in the mid-dermis, and I put in a load of neurotoxin or neuromodulator into the forehead. That's not what evidence-based medicine should be. There's this concept of evidence-based farming, where you actually go retrospectively and look at data, which I think is quite valuable. But evidence-based medicine started with this guy, David Sack. It was actually from McMaster University here in Canada, Ontario. And he put this forward in the mid-90s, but it didn't hit aesthetic medicine until the 2000s. 2000s, we started looking at aesthetic medicine. We started looking at evidence-based medicine for all of our journals, which is great. However, when papers get held up, when things get restricted based on statistical analysis and not on some good ideas, I think we just have to be careful to look at it through a lens of practicality so we don't inhibit some of the nicer, creative articles that are coming through. Too much science, I think, narrows our thinking. It narrows and shortens the way we think. Evidence-based medicine doesn't take in the art of what we do. Aesthetic medicine was always art. There was no such thing as clinical trials before there was neuromodulators. We couldn't do them because you couldn't do placebo randomized controlled trials. So for the majority of aesthetic medicine, there was no evidence-based medicine. It was all we followed the masters. I'm not saying that was right either. But there's a pendulum, as we all know. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Hegel talks about this. We're going too far one way if we're all science. I think we have to think about the creativity of what we did, because art, science, and philosophy all go together. The three all go together. These are all famous artists and scientists and philosophers, and they are the ones that push the needle forward. Many of you don't realize this, but Voltaire, who's a romantic poet and writer, was also a keen scientist and a mathematician who gamed the system to win the lottery because they figured out the mathematics of the lottery and became rich off it. Descartes, I think therefore I am, was actually, Cartesian geometry is still being used today. These were all scientists. The American Philosophical Society was started by Benjamin Franklin, who was a scientist. Goethe, a German romantic writer, discovered the premaxillary bone. So these people were also scientists. They all went to the same. The philosophical arts and the sciences were put together. Thinking creatively is critical to the improvement in our field. How important is creative talent to science? Albert Einstein was a fantastic violinist. But when you look at Nobel Prize winners from 1901 to 2005, those Nobel Prize winners have a 2.8 times increased chance of having a background in the creative arts. Nobel Prize winners are more likely to be artists than the general public or other scientists. It just shows you the creativity. Look at this. These are Nobel Prize winners. They were significantly increased in arts and writing, over 10 times. So the creative arts fuels a lot of the changes that happen in our aesthetic field because they did something called thought experiments. A thought experiment is when you come up with an idea in your mind. Galileo dropped 2 balls at the same time. They didn't hit the same time, but he imagined what would happen if there's no friction. Would they hit the same time? Newton, imagine what would happen if he shot a cannon off and a ball orbited the Earth. He described the orbit, gravity, based on a thought experiment. Sigmund Freud discovered a subconscious where our deepest, darkest desires are hidden, that can be mined. Albert Einstein, the most famous thought experimenter, jumped on a light beam, descended in an elevator, and described to us relativity. These were all thought experiments. Do you think any of these articles will get published today? Probably not, because there's no references, there's no one to cite, and there's no impact factor to increase. So these people who are putting forward these new ideas probably wouldn't get published today with the way our journals are set up. Maybe some of you have seen this. See if you can see how many times the players kick the white ball. Look closely and count.
Ready? Get rolling. You just knew that someone was going to be there for a minute. I knew it. I hope you.
Did you guys get it? How many times they passed the ball? So the correct answer is 12, but did you see this? Okay. So that experiment was done in 1999, and it was fascinating because selective attention study. What percentage of people do you think saw the suicidal man? It was actually a gorilla when they did the study. It was 52%. So half people didn't even see it. I would imagine most of the people in this room are pretty creative, and you have beyond selective attention, you're able to see that. But that's interesting because it means sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us. And I would argue that it's getting even more so. Artists see the extraordinary in the ordinary. They look at something and they're like, there's something there. I know, Doris, you and I have done this many times, where you look at something and you see something else. And I force my kids to do this all the time. I go somewhere like, what do you see that no one else sees? This is a swamp to many of us. This is 40 miles outside Paris. But not to Monet. It's not a swamp. This is in Eldon, Iowa. Just a house. But this also described American Gothic by Grant Wood in 1930. The extraordinary in the ordinary. Extraordinary in the ordinary is anywhere if you look around. You can see it in a cup of coffee if you look at it. There's so many different ways you can see something that then becomes an analogy for what we're doing in medicine. That's how Albert Einstein saw a train go outside. And he started thinking about relativity by looking at a train. Extraordinary and ordinary means looking beyond the obvious and imagining. 25 years ago, these two looked at a drug that was supposed to work for blepharospasm and saw something else. And we're all the better for their ability to see beyond the ordinary, to see the extraordinary, to look beyond the obvious, and see something that no one else saw. And it changed our whole world. Let's look at Mertz. Do you guys know that in 2007, when Mertz was looking at buying Bioform, I got a call to my office. So I was talking to Andreas about this yesterday, and they said, and Steve Basta was running Bioform at the time, and they called me up and they said, Steve, there's a company, MERS. I hadn't heard of MERS. It was a European company for all I knew. It wasn't in the aesthetic space, but they wanted to look at aesthetic medicine. So they're thinking about buying Bioform. So Steve Basta called me up, was heading up Bioform. He says, can they come to your office? Can you explain to them a little about aesthetic medicine? I said, sure. So they came. So I get a call. The MERS family is going to come to your office because they want to learn about aesthetic medicine. No problem. I have a conference room. We sit 20 people in my conference room, have them come. Well, the family and the shareholders are coming. Great, I got a conference room. Well, no, the family is coming, and there's like 40 of them. I'm like, oh, okay. So we had to like rent a room at the Ritz, and like they came with everyone. The family, the kids, the whole thing. I was like, this is a great company. It was a family company, and I was so impressed. And they all came to my office, and I explained to them what I thought aesthetic medicine was, and then they watched me do injections. They watched me do injections. And now you look 10 years later, and they're a field that's they're a company that's aesthetically driven, aesthetically focused. What a change. Talk about seeing and thinking beyond the obvious, being creative. The Merz family did that, and I was really impressed with that. But now they're moving forward with just aesthetics. But it wasn't that long ago. They were doing many other things. But I can tell you, when I spoke with them, I certainly didn't go over all the science of aesthetics. I told them about the passion in aesthetics and my passion for aesthetics. I'd like to believe when they were in my office and they felt my passion for what I do and for aesthetics, that's what got them interested. Not the 2-point improvements or the 1-point improvement. Not those things that are so important to the bean counters. So today, it's more than just the wrinkles. We started out with wrinkles, but now we're looking deeper. Look beyond the obvious. If I show you this and this, which is more threatening, which is more attractive? It's the same thing in humans. When we use neuromodulators, I believe we're also looking at the eyes. We're improving the eyes. It's not just the wrinkles. If we focus on the wrinkles, I think we get lost. I think we should see what else we're doing to the face. How about here? Do you see the difference? Subtle differences. I do a lot of first impression studies, and if you see the differences in the muscle patterns, we put the face in contrast, you really start to see the differences in the eyes. And this is something new I'm doing. Neuromodulators, or excuse me, fillers underneath, deep in the nasolabial fold. So it treats the nasolabial fold. I get the improvement, but look at something else, which I noticed. Look at her lips. Whoops, let me go back. The lips get better. We've never really looked. When we treat one area, there's other areas, like Arthur was just showing in treating the temple, how it affects the nasolabial fold. So other areas, it's looking beyond the obvious, looking beyond the area we're treating to the other areas we're treating. When you're putting in a neuromodulator or a filler, what else is happening to the face? But I think it goes much deeper than that. I think it goes much, much deeper than that than what we do. I think that's just the surface, and we're just getting started. What do you see in this face? If you look at her all throughout, what do you see? Where are the changes in her face that are looking beyond the obvious, not what everyone sees? What does no one see? If I show you this, where do you see a difference? corners of her mouth are elevated, and she instantly looks happier, friendlier, nicer. Is she actually happier, friendlier, nicer? I'm not sure, but I started studying this, and we're looking at the first impressions of these people because I want to know her story. What's her story? She's not just a wrinkle. She's not a fold. She's not a 2-point improvement. She's not a 1-point improvement like we'd have in our studies. Who is this person, and what is their story? Every face tells a story. If I show you this picture, what does her face tell you? What does his face tell you? If you look close at his face, he's telling you a story just by looking at his face. Our faces are incredible, and we're all so good. The human mind, we can discern another person's attitude and feelings immediately by looking at their face. What does his face tell you? Oh, he's determined. There's no doubt. You know exactly what he's thinking. We have to be careful because these people's faces tell a story, and this story is not the story you want to give. What story does her face tell you? Clearly, there's something about it that's disingenuous when she's been overtreated. We tell stories. We tell stories with our patients. When we treat their faces, we improve their moods, we improve the way they feel about themselves, and we tell stories. And I tell those stories. They're not just before and after pictures, they're stories. Art, imagination, philosophy, and storytelling. That's the creative part of what we do. Creativity is what makes aesthetic medicine great. It's what makes our field so unique and so different. It's what everyone wants to do. That's where we get our fulfillment, is this part of aesthetic medicine. This is what makes our field grow. I think the two go together. I think it's important we keep them together. And while I strongly, strongly believe in science, I mean, I'm a researcher. I've done plenty of level 1 studies. I've published over 100 articles. I'm a strong believer in the science. But I don't want to lose the creativity aspect of what we do because I think that's what makes us best. I think that's what drives our field. To raise new questions, to regard old problems from a new angle requires creative imagination. That's how we advance, innovate, and grow our field. I was in a session yesterday of innovation. It was fantastic. Corey presented on more neuromodulators, increasing doses. Thomas Rappel talked about the hands. We talked about injecting the masters. For those of you who were in that course, it was great. Jose Raul spoke fantastically about Althera. We had all these creative ideas. It was a brainstorm of creativity. For all of those that were in the room, we really enjoyed it because that creativity fuels advances in our field. But what it takes is something that we're losing, I believe, across the nation, is becoming reacquainted with ambiguity, uncomfortable pauses, and thinking. Uncomfortable pauses and thinking and ambiguity. No one does that anymore. When's the last time you stood in line or were in an elevator and didn't pull your phone out? Or had other people pull their phone out? If you put down your phone for a second, you'd be surprised how creative you get. I teach a college class, undergraduate course, at DePaul University in the Science of Beauty and its impact on culture and business in the U.S. And in that course, I always ask my students questions, and the first thing they say is, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know is a very simple answer because when we give multiple choice tests, it's very easy to say, I don't know, because it's a great strategy. I don't know, go on to the next one. It's how you get through the test quicker. But I always say to them, I know you don't know. I don't ask you questions you know the answers to. Tell me, what do you think? What do you think? Like, what do I think? Yeah, what do you think? What do I think? They get thrown back on their heels when I ask someone what do they think, and then they have to work through it. And they always come to the answer, but it takes a while to think, and they always feel good at the end when they think through it. Thinking is really becoming a lost art. Creativity doesn't take time. I don't have time to be creative. I just don't have time. I'm too busy. Work's too busy. My kids are too busy. I'm too busy. Creativity doesn't take time. It takes a flash of inspiration. You see something, you're like, wow, that's really inspiring. And you go write about it, or you record about it, or you take a photo of it. And you know what? Your mood elevates. Your mood elevates. For any of you who love creative arts, and I would imagine most of you do, otherwise why are you in aesthetics? You get a mood elevation when you get creative. It's really quite fascinating. But the key is I think you have to put your phone down. I think we have to put our phones down a little bit more. I would challenge all of you today, sometime today, when you're going to pull your phone out, think about it for a second. Don't pull it out, and look around the room and see if you get a flash of inspiration. It's amazing how easy it is to happen, and it's amazing how much of a sinkhole, a creative sinkhole, our phones have become, because it takes away our ability to think and become uncomfortable with pauses. So I would argue, And I would suggest you put this down for just a minute and see what happens. Because I think we're all aligned on this. We're all aligned. Industry, doctors, all societies, we're all aligned. These are fields that were great when they came out, and what happened to them? Laser hair removal is commoditized. LASIK surgery is commoditized. It's like toothpaste. Do we worry? Do we fear this is going to happen to neurotoxin fillers? Can you imagine a time period, 5, 10 years from now, where this field is so commoditized that it's not worth our time to do it? I worry about that. Because I see them in the future. That could happen if we don't remain creative and innovative with these products and with this field. So what I would say we should do is foster the creatives. Foster the creatives. Foster the creative arts in our fields. Those who think differently and those who question authority. Can we add creative retreats and activities to our curriculums? Maybe in our journals, in our societies, in our meetings, we have creative interpretations beyond just the scientific abstracts to interpret it, how it's being used in practice. Maybe we open up Shark Tanks, wherever you want to do it, so that we can bring in the people out there. We're all here. We're a small microcosm. Keep in mind there's a vast majority of people out there who are injecting, who want to get into aesthetics, and there's a lot of people out there who have great ideas. I'm sure like many of you, you go train somewhere, you meet some doctor, and they come up to you and say, I got a great idea. And they tell it to you, and you're like, wow, that's really a great idea. I never even thought of that. Where does that person go today? They don't have a place to go. They don't have a place to go. I say we bring them in. Invite them in. Welcome them to our meetings, our journals, and our societies. This is where the innovation stems for the future, in my opinion. We shall do a great deal for the science of aesthetics once we perceive not merely by logical inference, but with the immediate certainty of intuition, which is interesting because Nietzsche said this also. So while he didn't really mean God was dead and religion was dead, I don't think fillers and neurotoxins are dead. I think they're just the beginning. I think it's up to us in this room to express our creativity, to allow our creativity, to foster our creativity, so we can work for the science of aesthetics with intuition also, not just the two-point improvements. And this is where we all come into play. This room here is the creatives. You guys are it. That's why you're invited here. We're lucky MERS brought us here. I saw a lot of great stuff this weekend. A lot of great stuff. I saw Gabby speak. I saw Yanni inject. Kate Goldie, when you're up on stage and you speak, you're like undressing me with your words. They're so sultry, your voice. It's unbelievable to hear you on stage. You're fantastic. I saw Arthur. Arthur, in truth, Arthur, Jimmy Kimmel is better be in trouble because you're the best MC I've ever seen on stage. You saw a lot of great people speak. You saw a lot of great creative ideas, but that's just us. It's our job to go out there. Thank you to MERS for hosting us and giving us the wind behind our sails to go train what we're learning here. That's what we do. This room is the third standard deviation. We're the upper 1% to 2% of aesthetics. This room sees the extraordinary in the ordinary, and I know it because I've spoken with many of you and I'm friendly with many of you. This room sees beyond the obvious. This room tells the stories, this room influences, and this room teaches, and this room creates. That's why you're all here. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. This room is incredibly powerful. All of us in here together are powerful. And I think the future direction of aesthetics rests in the hands and minds of the creatives. Yes, the scientists are there. They're going to help. They're going to help us define it. But it's the creatives who always move the needle forward. It's always the creatives who do it. And that's what I think this room does. I think we all work together to do that, to innovate together. And that, to me, is something I question, are we all ready to do together? Thanks so much for listening.